Welcome back to Digital Diary, Ventures of a Computerized Quilter. And today we're talking about vintage quilts. What's a vintage quilt? What does that mean? Does it mean it has to be at least as old as me? Or older than that? What do you guys think?
Well, I think a vintage quilt is generally something that has been around for a while. I mean, a vintage quilt from the 50s would be as old as me, but they used different techniques back then. Hands pieced. Most of mine are hand pieced. Some are done on older machines, and you can tell by the stitches. The fabrics tell me if something's vintage. Feed sacks are a dead giveaway in vintage.
Yeah, what other fabrics? How does that affect it being a vintage quilt?
I think a lot of those older quilts were made from whatever they had. A lot of times that's extra, fabric from making their clothing or even used in old worn clothing. Again, and the feed sacks were mentioned, but you never know what kind of materials you're going to get with some of those older quilts. And a lot of times if we're trying to age a vintage quilt, not just the pattern of that quilt top, but the fabrics that were used will help us, determine the age. And I know I'm not the best at that, aging those quilts, but
yeah, the fabrics, I think, tell a story. You're absolutely right. I come from generations of quilters, and they used every single scrap, and it was not uncommon to have that dress cut down a couple times for the next youngest, and then finally end up in the quilt. So the fabric lasts longer than when the quilt was actually made.
And a lot of times I've even seen a piece made out of pieces. So they kept every little scrap, and that square has actually 3 different pieces in it. I've seen that quite often. And sometimes the fabric, I think, not all fabrics hold up as well as others.
No,
Yes,
they don't.
And you get different densities of fabrics because a lot of times there's fabrics from dresses and there's fabrics from work clothes. So you get such a variety of densities in there too.
The next question then is, should we even be quilting these, or are they more valuable left alone?
Oh, I think the true value of the quilt is what it means to the person. Throughout history, when women made quilts, they left quilts unfinished. There wasn't enough lifetime to finish all the quilts. That's true today.
Yeah.
I have finished quilts that my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother started. And hopefully there'll be somebody beyond me that'll finish my stockpile as well. I say finish them and use them. Nobody ever started a quilt thinking, I hope someone just keeps this in a drawer.
And also, I think if it's not finished, it's easier for another generation to just toss it. Where if it's finished, at least they think about it and it's a discussion. And so I always think finish them. Finish is much better than, haunting them in a closet or a drawer somewhere.
well, I have to admit though, I've seen some vintage quilt tops that aren't really in a condition to be finished. So I take it on a case by case basis. Each one has to be evaluated. Are there fabrics missing? Pieces of that quilt missing? Is there a lot of damage or staining? Things like that.
Yeah.
I look at some of the quilts that some come in and you think, they're really special. And it's like, this really should be hand quilted. But it will, if you wait for that or find somebody to hand quilt it, it may never get quilted, So I try to just be gentle with them and stay with the vintage theme and do the best I can. And then they're, like you said, they're a quilt, and not just a quilt top anymore.
And I tell some people this quilt is finished, but it's more for eye candy. It's not one that, because some of the seams are barely holding together, and, if they use it a lot, they're going to pull apart, and sometimes, that's all that they are going to be good for, but that's okay. Sometimes that's a good thing.
But there are some precautions that we have to take when working with them, because like we've talked about so far, some of them are really delicate. First one, I've had customers ask quite a bit, should I wash it first?
Oh,
No.
no.
Because
No, I'll
it'll probably fall
quilt them
apart.
with stains.
But I've also told my customers, if they don't have a lot of stains, just, a few blood spots here and there from pricked fingers when it was being made, that's part of that quilt story.
And my question is, some of them get really kind of adamant that they want to wash it. And so, first of all, some of those less dense fabrics will just turn into nothing but knots. But second of all, my question to them is, okay, if you can't get stains out, do you still want the quilt? Well, of course I do. Well, then you have nothing to lose to wait until you've quilted it, because you plan to keep it even if stains don't come out.
Well, I think they can be washed. It's how you do it. You don't throw
Right.
it in your agitating washing machine. And there are products out there that work very well. You can edit this part out if you want, but I do sell stuff in my shop for vintage quilts. And I swear by it because I've used it.
Mm-hmm.
And
And it's non-bleach.
it's a non-bleach. And just be gentle with them.
I wash them in as cold a water as I can stand, sometimes just as little of soap in it that I can think that it will withstand, and wash it in cold water. And then I try not to stretch them out. I try to let them drain as much as I can, so I don't stretch them out when I take them out of the tub or whatever I wash them in. We wash them in a clawfoot tub. We installed a clawfoot tub just to wash vintage quilts in our studio, in the bathroom in our studio. And then we just let them drain for a couple days or a day, and then take them out, and just be as gentle as possible, because sometimes they smell bad. Sometimes they've been in a trunk too long and they just need some attention.
Yeah, I've put it in a laundry basket and then keep turning the laundry basket, and it can drain out from there too. It's like a quilt colander.
That works.
So how do we deal with, once that we have it ready to go on our machine, what are some of the things that we can do to stabilize it?
Sometimes if the fabrics are really thin or frail, I definitely recommend putting another layer of fabric between the batting and the top, just to give it a little more stability and try to hold it together a little bit better.
Well, it'll keep the batting fibers from coming through those thin fabrics as well, because that's something that happens a lot, is the bearding of the batting through those older fabrics.
Yeah, the weave is not as tight. It also will help from show through. For the most part, you're generally putting a new fabric on an old quilt.
Right.
And some people want color, but they've got white on the top. And so a sheet of muslin between the quilt and the batting helps with show through as well.
Yeah.
Does it matter what kind of needle you use or the size of the needle? Any of those?
Well, I use a smaller needle all the time. And so I don't even change my needle to go on a vintage quilt. I would think a smaller needle would be better, but my opinion only.
I don't change my needle either, and I use a
I don't.
I probably use a little bit larger than Paige does, but I use the same needle and generally the same type of thread as that I normally use.
Does it
I
matter
tend to
if
use
it's
a little bit different because my go-to thread is more of a shiny thread, and I don't, most of the time I will go to more matte finish, like So Fine or Omni, and I actually, if I'm trying to keep it looking vintage, I make my stitches a little bigger.
I do that often as well, depending on the pattern that's going on the
Right.
quilt.
Right.
Mhm.
I'll use So Fine a lot of times on vintage quilts and drop down to a 3.5 needle. I think that another thing we always have to be careful of is a lot of them are hand pieced and you have to be gentle with them. And I never put tension on a hand pieced quilt. I always just kind of ride it out, you know, and let it go where it needs to go and not try to square it up or anything. Just, you know.
And I also don't choose, even if, so if they aren't going to do some, you know, more traditional pattern, I try to choose a pattern that doesn't have a lot of overstitching, because I don't think the fabrics, some of the fabrics can't handle, you know, stitches in the same place over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
So I generally encourage a pattern with very little, if any, overstitching.
Same.
Yeah, what about those quilts that parts of them are good, and you know that parts of them are just going to fall apart if you start stitching on it? What do you do with that?
Well, we do repairs on quilts. I grew up watching my grandmother piece a patch over a section of the quilt that was starting to fall apart. You don't take it off, you just put something in. I've done that a lot, and generally speaking, the customers are more than willing for you to do that to preserve it, because some fabrics just fall apart.
At times I can, it depends, like if I'm using a digital pattern, I'll hand baste like a little open seam or a problem back together, and then I'll redraw my digital pattern to where it'll sweep across there, you know, just kind of maybe like curve through that bad place and kind of you stitch it down and hide it both at the same time, if that's possible. It's not always possible.
And
Yeah, I do both
sometimes
those things. Go ahead, Georgia.
sometimes you can't save it, but you can save portions of it. And I've quilted as much as I could so that they could make pillows out of it, or Christmas stockings, different things like that. Save as much as you can, but you can't always save the whole quilt.
True.
That's
Yep.
what I run into a lot, actually. So I'll get vintage quilt tops in that are they're in no condition to become a finished quilt, but it has a lot of sentimental value, and that's why they're brought in, because they have value. But there are other things that you can do with that quilt other than finish it as a quilt. And I've done everything from making the pillows, like Georgia mentioned, to framing portions of it behind glass or, in a nice frame. Things like that, or even just suggesting that they fold it nicely and display it, on a shelf or something. Don't put it away in a cupboard. I believe in using them.
Me
I
too.
understand the idea of preserving. I do, but you know what? What's the point of having something that great grandma made unless you're actually looking at it and loving it once in a while?
I had a customer take a good portion of the quilt was usable, so we ended up cutting it down, but the part that wasn't, she used a shadow box, and in it she had those pieces. She had a picture of her great grandmother. She had a little story. It was awesome. And then they presented it to her. I forget, she was, I think, 101, something like that. And they presented that to her because she wasn't in a place where she had that much room to display things anyway. But by putting it in that little shadow box, it was really a wonderful reminder of what she had done. It was beautiful.
I had a customer who enjoyed going to thrift stores and finding these orphan quilt tops, and she would rescue them and then bring them to me, and I would just do an edge to edge because for her it didn't have that much importance, but she wanted to save them.
Mhm.
And that was, I just loved her stories about which thrift store and where in her travels she picked them up. It was great fun to talk about.
Well, a lot of people will pick up things off of eBay. The quilt that's behind me came off of eBay from someone that knew she was never going to hand piece a grandmother's flower garden. And this one is hand pieced, and it did smell bad. She made the mistake of washing it, and she had to press each and every one of those little hexes. And it took her days,
I bet.
weeks to press it again.
So when we do quilt them, does it need to be quilted according to the style and age of the quilt, or do we have freedom to do whatever we want?
I think that depends on your customer. Some quilts have a definite style to them. You also have to pay attention to the size, like the piecing on this one. If I had something that was too open, I would have sections that didn't have stitching. And I think the quilting is what is going to stabilize it and give it longevity. So I have a denser pattern on this one. And it is a semi-custom, and I am hitting every single little hexie.
Yeah, I agree. You have to evaluate each quilt on its own merits based on what that quilt is, its condition, what the customer wants, and what they plan to do with it, of course. But I don't think there are any rules personally. I think you can put what you want to on it, what's going to work best for that quilt, even if that means a modern design on a vintage quilt. Now, I'm not saying every time, but I think it's okay.
And sometimes I'll use just like a standard meander, just so it doesn't distract from the quilt top at all. Because sometimes it's not about the quilting. A lot of times it's about the quilt. So just to kind of keep that in the background and let the quilt shine and keep the quilting back there just to hold the quilt together pretty much.
So let's look at some pictures of the vintage quilts that we have and talk about them just a little bit. Here's one of the quilts that's very similar to what Paige has behind her, and it's not quilted yet. But we do see there are some irregularities in the piecing. I can see some places where maybe it folded over. So this, again, is hand pieced.
Look at the fussy cutting of the poppies on that red. All the time that they took, to piece that together is amazing.
It's a special quilt.
And it's so nice that it can be found and then quilted and used. Here's another one, very common pattern.
I love Dresden plates. These are like one of my favorites, but when they come into the shop to be quilted, I always almost pray and cross my fingers that nobody wants them custom quilted, because those plates, especially the vintage ones like this, they are never really round. I mean, look at that.
They're never round, and your spacing is different.
Yes.
And every
But
one of
these
those
are one of my-
Dresdens. Yeah, it's going to
These
be a
are my
challenge.
favorites too.
But this
I
would
do, I
definitely
like-
be one of those that you would put muslin under it, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
See
you
those
can see right through that.
very visibly, yeah.
Ooh, not so straight lines. Lots of color. What would we do with this one? Would we do an edge to edge? Would we do a custom? What do you think?
I see edge to edge.
I do
Yeah,
too.
personally, a texture would be great on this because the colors and the fabrics are busy and they're kind of the same value, and the quilting's not really going to show. So a texture alone, you know, something like clamshells even.
Right.
I think with the patterns that are used, even something a bit more modern would go well on this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here's some of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, when a fabric goes, it will go repeatedly. If that fabric's used 16 times in the quilt,
Mhm.
chances are 16 times it went away. It just
Right.
left.
Some of these fabrics just don't last as well.
Mm-mm.
But isn't that one of the benefits of quilting it, is it's going to give it stability so that it can last longer?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, some finished quilts. Baptist fan.
And you
Love
can
the
see this
fan.
quilt, they had fade at the bottom of the quilt. I don't know if it was in a window or somewhere like that, but, and that's one thing, the stains will come out, but fade, they're not going to be able to fix that. But notice how tiny, those little bow ties were 1 inch in the cornerstones. Those are 1 inch bow ties. I love that quilt. I hoped she wouldn't come pick it up, but she did.
I even love the fading because that is history.
It is. I mean,
Sorry.
I have things that I'll do over and over again, like the arcs. I like to get as much stitching across them without overpowering the quilt, because those are all bias. They're all bias and they're going to stretch. The other thing is, how do you do the edges? You send these home, but they have to figure out, am I going to cut off that quilt?
Mm.
I think they should be done with the bias binding with the edges, the way they were.
Yep.
I'm with you. I like that.
This one's so cute.
I like that.
Very simple point-to-point design.
Hmm?
But how perfect to have those little circles in the center, yellow centers, and it's
Yeah,
just
this
stunning.
quilt was originally tied in the center of all
Ah,
those yellows, very stained with a carded wool batting. So we took it apart and I needed something to hold that fabric together in the
it's
center.
fabulous.
It does. Another one, big, very big. Sometimes they were very, very large.
Mhm.
But it can modernize an older quilt by adding a lot more quilting to it than they would have done at the time, maybe. So you, in the center, using a curve and draw a pattern, it was a quick way of placing all those curves in each one of those little diamonds and yet retaining that old look.
Mhm.
Oh, and swirls.
Mhm. This is a great swirl pattern because it doesn't go over itself. It really covers well. Pretty much every, no line is more than an inch apart or much more than an inch apart. And this was one made out of old clothes.
Ah, so did it have different densities in the fabrics?
This one wasn't as bad as some, but yes, there are some that were slick and some were thin and some were, more coarse. I've done others more that way than this one, but this one by most standards was pretty easy to quilt. It really wasn't badly made at all, and seams weren't coming apart, so that was nice.
So another one of these quilted very
was-
differently.
Yeah, that was a vintage. Her grandmother made that quilt, and she recognized some of the fabrics from her grandmother's dresses and from her jumpers when she was little and stuff like that. I wanted to really take care with this quilt, so that's exactly how she wanted to quilt it. Was a 1/4 inch inside of each hexie, so there was 3,600 hexes. So I was there for a week or so quilting that quilt, but it turned out really special.
Mhm.
Yeah, I had one of these and I did the 1/4 inch in because those seams are open. There is no ditch. There's no way you can ditch it anyhow. So this
No.
was, and this is how they would have quilted this
Yeah.
years ago.
Exactly. And again, they're always hand pieced. I don't think that you can machine piece a hexie, a grandmother's flower garden. I think it has to be hand pieced. So, you have to take all of that into consideration,
And this is lovely. I know that my family has a history of doing the count and cross stitch on their quilts, but also on other linens. So they had, all sorts of table linens that might have had this.
Exactly. And I think this was a kit. You could see there was still stenciled like an A,
Blue
B,
dots.
and C, and the dots. Yes.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure that this was ever. I'm thinking this might have been a tablecloth,
Mhm.
and it had some rust stains in it, and it had some other stains. And this is one that we cleaned, and I got the rust stains out with a rust remover and a bleach pen, and it really turned out spectacular. It really turned out to be a neat piece when it was done. I was surprised that it cleaned up and it came out the way it did. But yeah, I enjoyed doing this one.
It's beautiful.
That's beautiful.
So thanks for joining us for another episode of Digital Diary, Adventures of a Computerized Quilter, and our vintage quilts. And I hope that you, when you see a vintage quilt, recognize there's a story behind it and that it is worth preserving, whether as a quilt or as a pillow, or even just behind glass in a frame. These are special things that we can share from generation to generation. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.